I am always amazed that so many people are willing to put their hard-earned after-tax savings into institutional investments like endowment policies, annuities, and unit trusts. Many people also have to contribute to some kind of pension plan organized by their employer, whether they want to or not. The returns from these types of investments are generally poor, and some of them have the huge added disadvantage of being very difficult or even impossible to get out of. So the first part of this webinar examines why it is better to go into the market for yourself, rather than to put your money into institutional investments like insurance policies, annuities, and unit trusts. Secondly, as a private investor on the JSE and assuming that you have decided to invest directly on the market for yourself, you need to be aware of the dominant role played by the institutional investors on the JSE, because the decisions that they make and their way of doing things will impact on your perceptions of the market and the decisions that you make. Let us begin by considering the problems associated with the two primary institutional investments open to the private investor. Firstly, insurance. Almost everyone has some sort of insurance. It is important for you to understand that there are two main types of insurance: term insurance and endowment insurance. A term insurance policy is one that covers you against risks that you cannot afford, such as the theft of your car, a household robbery, or your own death or disability. Covering those risks is, in my opinion, the proper function of insurance. The other type of insurance is a long-term savings and investment plan. Endowment and annuity policies are basically investments, and should be evaluated as investments by comparing the returns that they offer to the returns on other investments that are available to private investors. Often an insurance company will mix term insurance with savings element, because that makes it much harder to calculate exactly what return is being offered. But in general, insurance policies offer very poor returns. It is almost always far better to buy the shares of the company that is trying to sell you the policy than the policy itself. I know of a person who bought 1,000 rands worth of Liberty Life shares when they were first offered to the public by Donnie Gordon. Today, those shares are worth around 20 million rand, excluding dividends. You see, I don't know of any insurance policy offered by any insurance company anywhere that has come even close to that. And I don't know of anyone who has become rich by buying endowment or investment insurance, but I know of some insurance salesmen who've become rich by selling it. You need to understand how an insurance company works. Like all the big institutions, insurance companies get contributions from hundreds of thousands or even millions of individuals every month. They pool those contributions into large lump sums, which they invest mostly on the JSE. There, in a good year, they can make 30% or 40% or more, and when you reach 65 or whatever the date is on your policy, they pay you your contributions back, plus, say, 12% if you're lucky. And with the difference, they build the Liberty Life building in Braamfontein and pay their shareholders a nice fat dividend. The point is that the stock market is the engine which generates the wealth in South Africa. What you don't need is a middleman who stands between you and the stock market, skimming off the lion's share of your returns. Another huge disadvantage of insurance policies is that they can be notoriously difficult to get out of. Now let us consider unit trusts. These are better than insurance policies, mostly because you can at least sell them when you want to. The problem is that historically about 80% of unit trusts worldwide have underperformed the indexes of the sectors in which they compete. Now, an index is just an average. So if you invest in unit trusts, you need to ask yourself why you are paying somebody to have the virtual certainty of underperforming an average. This you could do for yourself. Theoretically, the chimpanzee in the Pretoria Zoo could do it better. So ask yourself the question again. Why are you paying somebody to underperform an average? Hopefully, you are now reasonably convinced that you are better off managing your own money in the share market than handing it over to some sort of institutional middleman. The simple truth is that nobody cares about your money except you. I don't care about your money, I care about my money. You care about your money, so you should learn how to manage it effectively. Now let us consider the way that big institutional investors go about their business. As I said at the start of this webinar, if you want to make money from shares, it is important to understand something about how institutions actually work, because of the size that they have and the impact that they have on the market. When you make money in the share market as a private investor, you will invariably do so at the expense of the big institutions, because for all intents and purposes, they are the market. Institutions account for something like 90% of all trades put through the JSE, while private investors like you and me make up the other 10%. There are basically three types of institutions: insurance companies, unit trusts, and pension funds. And they all work more or less in the same way. They take small contributions from hundreds of thousands or even millions of people every month, which they then invest, mostly on the JSE. These huge pools of funds are controlled and managed by their fund managers, who are highly qualified and very highly paid professionals. Because of the limited options for investment in South Africa, it is often difficult for fund managers to place a continuous and large flow of funds effectively. Fund managers in South Africa are a small group of mostly men, and as we have said, they are completely dominant in what happens on the JSE, especially with the blue chip shares, which have actually become known as institutional stocks. Typically, fund managers have high-level qualifications, like a Master of Business Administration or a PhD in Financial Management, and many of them are chartered accountants. They are very highly paid, and their job is to place those contributions which come pouring in every day. But at the end of the day, a fund manager is really just a man with a job. So what is the most important thing for a man with a job? It's to keep his job, of course. That is his primary concern. And in the fund management business, the best way to keep your job is to toe the line. In other words, to do what most of the other fund managers are doing. If everyone is selling Pick n Pay, then you should be selling Pick n Pay. If they are buying Prosus, then you should be buying Prosus, and so on. Suppose for a moment that I was a fund manager with, say, Sanlam, and that I went one day to a meeting of the other fund managers and told them that today was the day to invest in the gold market. To support this assertion, I would show them plenty of complicated statistics and charts, and suppose that after a time I was successful in persuading them, and they decided to make a large investment into gold shares based on my analysis. And then, 6 months later, suppose that that investment turns out to be a dismal failure, and the fund loses 50 million rand as a result. I would probably lose my job. And what is more, because it's such a small exclusive profession, it would probably be very difficult for me to ever work as a fund manager again. Unless, of course, Old Mutual had invested in gold shares at about the same time, because then I would be in good company. I couldn't lose my job because Old Mutual had made the same mistake at more or less the same time. What is the result of this? The result is that the fund managers tend to move like a herd of sheep. When one crosses the bridge, they all cross the bridge. And the worst thing for a fund manager is to be left on this side of the bridge when everyone else is on the other side, because that is how you lose your job in the fund management business. This tendency to move as a group is obviously very important. It underlies the broad sweeping trends that you find in the market as a whole, and especially in blue chip shares. But of course, as a private investor, you can only really make money on the JSE when you are right and the market, on average, is wrong. In other words, you have to be a maverick or a contrarian. As Warren Buffett has said, you need to be greedy when others are fearful, and fearful when others are greedy. But you can't expect to beat the market if you are the market, and big institutions are the market, which explains why institutional investments like unit trusts and insurance policies lag well behind the index and are invariably disappointing. In fact, they are so disappointing that these days many institutions invest in index tracking funds, which exactly match the makeup of the index. That way, at least, they can't underperform it. The existence of index funds is a clear admission by the big institutions that they cannot actually do what they are paid to do, which is to beat the market. Your contributions to institutional investments like unit trusts, insurance policies, and pension funds will generally have a very dismal performance, especially after you allow for the effects of inflation and tax. But as a private investor, making your own decisions, you can beat the market because you have some significant advantages over institutional fund managers. Your biggest advantage is that you are small. When a big institution begins buying a share, they might begin at, say, 100 Rand a share, and by the time they are finished, they will be buying the share at 120, because the sheer size of their transaction pushes the price up, and the opposite happens when they are selling. But your 20,000 Rand or 50,000 Rand will not move the price of that share 1 cent. Another advantage you have is that you don't need to call a committee to make a decision. You can make decisions quickly and change your position whenever the market changes. You're not bogged down by bureaucracy. And some large institutions, like unit trusts, are compelled by law to keep 5% of their money in cash, which means that they can only invest the other 95%. You have no such restrictions. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, because of their enormous size, the institutions can only invest in 150 or so of the largest blue-chip shares, which, as we have said earlier, actually become known as the institutional stocks for this reason. You, on the other hand, can choose from a much wider range of smaller shares, simply because you have less money to invest. For example, you could easily buy 20,000 Rands worth of a penny stock like Santova. But if a big institution decided to buy, say, 500 million Rands worth of its shares, which they would probably want to do, they would have bought the company twice over. So you can optimize out of 300 shares. Big institutions can only look at maybe half that number. In the share market, small is beautiful.